go. Now we are all set. Thank you all for coming this morning. We have Travis Breaux, who's here from, is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah,
Okay.
actually,
Okay.
Of all the choices, right.
And maybe you should try to pronounce it differently just for the short. Just change it up.
Yeah, okay. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We cut it out.
And he is here from Carnegie Mellon, and he is going to talk to us today about computational analysis of privacy policies and much more. But I will let him do the talking.
Great,
So,
thank
welcome.
you. So it's a reasonably small group, so we could actually have more interaction if you want. What I'm going to talk about today are two projects where we have essentially been studying how to translate law and policy into a formal model with the intent of doing some kind of automated reasoning. And there's different kinds of reasoning that we want to do. But to give you some background about myself, so my background is in software engineering. I typically work in requirements engineering, which is the first stage of building large systems, where you're still trying to figure out what it is you're trying to build. And so in that context, laws and policies, especially when they're imposed on the development team by outsiders or regulators, can present challenges, because the developers have to understand what the text means in order to build against it and then actually test against it. So, so as I said, I'll talk about two projects. The first project, to motivate the project, you could think about if you were starting a company here in Maryland, you might have a storefront, you might work with a local county to figure out what you need to do to comply with the local law. But information systems are obviously more complicated. You might have customers who are in Massachusetts and Maryland, but then you might store your data in Nevada, and you may grow your business to actually include EU citizens. So about 7 years ago, the big challenge was trying to align US privacy law with European privacy law, which was very different at the time. And safe harbors were negotiated in order to allow the exchange of data so that EU citizen data could be stored in the US, but not subject to some of the other laws in the US. That has since broken down twice. The shield was created to sort of replace the safe harbor once it was discovered that companies were making assurances but not following through in the way EU regulators were expecting. And now there's the new GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that the EU is enacting. And so US companies are really scrambling to figure out what they need to do. So what I'm going to talk about is how you take laws from these different jurisdictions and then try to reconcile them, right, into a concept I'll call a watermark. So to give you a lay of the land, the notion of a watermark, you can think of it not in terms of a digital watermark or a watermark in paper to understand if something is fake. Rather, it's the notion that the seas rise and fall, and typically what you're doing as a company is you're trying not to find the lowest possible point of compliance. You're trying to find the highest standard of care. And what that would give you is a more defensible position in the court of law. Some examples of the kinds of legal statements you would see across jurisdictions range from things like policy requirements, such as create a security program, which is intentionally broad. The idea is you would hire people, you would develop training for those people. It's more of a policy description, right? Contrast that with something like employing confidential encryption or using standard encryption, whatever the standards might be for industry. That's going to be more functional, and in that context, you could imagine a developer having a meaningful conversation about what they need to do to create a system that would implement some standard. And then in the middle, you might have things like what the definition of health information is and how that would contrast across states. And the idea is that you can have real conflicts where one law requires you to include health information in your data breach notification policy, and one state requires you to exclude that health information. And so now what you do, right, you can obviously filter against the person and their state of residence, and then present that to a regulator to demonstrate that you're complying. So when we were looking at this problem, we set out to create a process, a manual process, because we want to understand what an analyst would actually have to do to comply, realizing that law and what in-house counsel might do is kind of a black box to academics like us. So with this process, you would start with two documents, regulatory documents from two states. The first thing you would do is use a language that we developed. After many years of analyzing regulations, we developed a kind of not informal markup language, right? I'll show you an example of what that looks like. You would manually encode it, and then using tools, you could parse that language and process it, essentially into a graph-based representation where you could look for potential problems or similarities across the law. Next, what you do with those itemized regulations is you do some comparisons. We also did this manually. We developed a set of heuristics that will allow us to make comparisons between phrases. And then lastly, we would try and generate our watermark. So I'll walk you through this process with an example to show you what it looks like. So the legal requirement specification language, as I said, it's kind of like a markup. The basic idea is you would first have to annotate the structure of the law. This is really important. There's sections in laws, they have paragraphs and subparagraphs, and these references that link to paragraphs are cross-referenced. As I'll show you, those cross-references are used to kind of orchestrate the legal interpretation. It's actually really fascinating from my standpoint. But here's an example of a legal statement that would be mapped into this language. The idea is we would actually copy the law into a text editor, and then we would replace certain keywords, we would add some additional structure. Here you have a data collector, that's the role that a legal statement is covering. You have some number of conditions, like doing business in the state, which would be Maryland or Nevada, I think in this case, accepts a payment card, and then you have the requirement. This is a prescription, it could be a permission or an obligation, or even a prohibition. And you can have more complicated things, like here's a paragraph where you have an exception. That means that this statement doesn't apply if this statement applies, right? Or actually, I think the exception works in reverse. It says you have to do this, except if you're doing that. So let me show you what happens when you process this. It turns out that when you look at these statements in the aggregate, the interpretation spans multiple paragraphs. So this is a Nevada data breach law. Down here in paragraph 5D, there's a statement that says we're going to talk about payment cards in this law, and that definition of payment cards can be found in this separate law. So you have to go and find that other law and find that definition and pull that in, right? Then you also have cross-references. So in paragraph 1, requirement 1 would refer to payment cards, right, as defined down here. You can have definitions that were referred to in other definitions, and those get pulled up. And then you can have exemptions. So this is an exemption for telecommunication providers. Basically says if you're a telecommunication provider, then all those requirements in paragraph 1 don't really apply to you, right? So now you can imagine you're reading this law straightforward, right, front to back, and you're trying to manage all these cross-references and interpretations in order to understand what it is you need to do. And so that's the challenge that we're trying to focus on. In the future, what we'd like to do is create some kind of question-answering system where you can actually navigate these regulations. But what we've done to date is we've identified a number of interesting compliance patterns just through the modeling. It turns out that regulators have ways to impose discipline on industry softly so that they can slowly evolve over time to catch up. This notion of process suspension is if you're going to send out data breach notices, you might want to suspend that process while law enforcement is doing an investigation. Down here with indemnification, the idea with Nevada is, well, they really want you to comply with standards, PCI DSS being the standard for security payment card information. And to do that, they're going to say, well, you can't share your data or move it outside of your data center, which is pretty useless at that point. If you do that, then you'll be indemnified. Or if you comply with PCI DSS, you'll be indemnified. If you do something in between, like you don't do PCI DSS, and you share your data, then you're at risk of data breach liability, right? So they're kind of saying, here's this really dangerous place, you could be in that space, or you could be in this very safe space that we've created, 2 possible safe spaces for you. And so these patterns emerge in our analysis, and they could be something that if you were a regulation designer, you might try to use to deal with a hard situation, right? So let me show you how we build these watermarks. Again, this was a manual process, so there's a lot of subjectivity and interpretation involved in it. But the goal was then eventually to collect that data and think about how we can automate some of the comparisons. So here you have 2 statements, one about providing notice as soon as practical, the other one about notifying the owner or licensee. One of the first things we would do is we'd say, well, these sentences are seemingly similar. So we would give it a metric, which is an SE, meaning they're equivalent statements, knowing that there are differences within the statements. So then we would work at the phrase level and try and identify those differences. So we'd say, well, one statement talks about a licensor, one statement talks about a licensee. Is that a meaningful distinction? Does it mean the person who's licensing the data to you versus the person you license the data to, right? So we would itemize that. And then lastly, we would notice that one of these statements has this additional constraint, which is you have to do this as soon as reasonably possible, right? So is that meaningful? And so with the notion of a watermark, you want to basically integrate these two statements to create a higher level, a higher standard of care. And so using these itemized phrases, we could construct manually a statement that has this broader context, right? It has additional requirements that have to be done to comply with both Massachusetts and Maryland's law on data breach. And so one of the outcomes is recognizing that we have one way to manage these differences, which we call union. That's sort of taking the union of everything to create that highest watermark. Highest watermark. The second thing is disjoint. So in this case, you would design your systems so that you handle the data in a disjoint way. You have your Massachusetts data set and you have your Maryland data set. And there may be some places where the data comes together and there are other places where the data stays apart. So that could be very expensive. And then the last is just to find the minimum possible standard, right? So do the minimum that's required and then always point to the state where you're doing the minimum. So as a strategy for compliance. So some interesting insights as we started doing our comparisons. So this is Connecticut, that's Connecticut and Mississippi. As we started doing our comparisons and building this data set, what we found was in red, the number of regulations, the number of requirements in these regulations in the union started to increase. Where we started doing the union in terms of finding those watermarks, that actually didn't grow as fast, right? So even though it's a manual process, the idea is you can reduce the number of requirements you have to deal with, but they might be more complicated requirements because they have to deal with these different constraints across jurisdictions. The other thing we found is that in general, data breach law, while it's very similar across states, there's a lot of copying by states. You can see there's a lot of differences. So the G2 and the R2, these have to do with new constraints or missing constraints. So the green portion in this diagram is basically showing that as you build this composite, this aggregate watermark, we're finding that the variation, the differences between the states is still pretty substantial, right? Whereas the orange is more about semantic differences, so you might say this constraint is a subclass of that other one, so if we choose that other one, we'll comply with the subclass, and so on. And so then we asked lawyers, we said, okay, you practice law, what do you think about these watermarks? And so they said different things. They said, oh, the union is more strict, meaning you can do less things, others said it appears less demanding, so it really depends on the union that's taking place, the watermark. And then of course, lastly, the very pessimistic comment, which was, well, companies will only do the minimum anyway, right? And so I thought it was very reflective for us to kind of understand how, industry, meaning legal analysts, would view the results of the work, given that we're taking it from the perspective of software engineering. So I was going to transition a little bit to another project. Basically, the key takeaway from this work was that while we could do this work manually, our goal is really to automate, right? We live in computer science, we're trying to find solutions to problems, how naive that might be. But ultimately, we wanted to find a tool that could help us reason over these regulations. The key technical challenge was semantics, right? So we have these phrases, this state, it has an anaphoric reference to a state. Where was that state mentioned in the document? How is a tool going to interpret what this state means, right? That's context that we as readers really understand. So what we wanted to do was to find a domain where the problem was even more restrictive, so there was less variation in what the text could talk about, with the intent of kind of really getting a handle on this and hopefully achieving some degree of formalization. So we moved into privacy policy. So privacy policies appear on websites. There's that link at the bottom that no one kind of reads. They tend to be long and legalese-like. But we looked at a specific subset of policies. So we looked at privacy policies for mobile apps. So has anyone ever used the application Waze before? I imagine in Maryland it's a great app because it can tell you where the speed traps are, right, with those cameras. Gosh, that's brutal. But it's also good for finding police cars when you're speeding or you're driving safely, but you're still nervous about that. Basically, what made Waze possible had to do with very low-cost access to services that Waze didn't have to build out themselves, right? So when you think about user management, If you can use a third-party service like Facebook to do login to your app, that saves you time and money. And it's very easy to integrate with. If you need to store your data, you don't have to go and buy racks and servers. You can use Amazon Web Services, right? Their storage service, in order to locate your data and also have it integrate with your app. And then lastly, there are companies like Flurry that help you do a couple things. One, they give you mobile analytics, so they tell you how people are using your app, but they also give you access to advertising services, which means you can make a little money in the process, right? So, what we did was we looked at the privacy policies of these different companies. Specifically, what I'll talk about is the policy of Waze and Flurry, and how we try to formalize these policies. So similar to our work in law, what we would do is annotate the policies using grounded analysis and try and formulate a set of concepts that were critical to creating statements that we could then formalize. So let me walk you through some of this. This is a statement from a policy. We will provide your information to third-party companies. So we were looking for different semantic roles, right? So if you're familiar with semantic frames, it's very similar to that concept. We were looking specifically for an information type that had some kind of action that was performed. We looked at collection actions, transfer or sharing actions, and then usage. And usage was typically used to denote the purpose for which the data was used. So if you read a lot of these policies, you start to see there's a pattern, right? They talk about collection, then separately they talk about usage, independent of collection, and then they talk about transfer, who they share it with. And sometimes there's purposes on collection and transfer, but mostly there's purposes on usage. This is important because there's this thing called the collection and use limitation principle, which is part of the OECD guidelines on privacy. This is an international standard. It's adopted more in Europe than in the US. But the idea is that when you collect data for one purpose, you should then ensure that you only ever use it for that purpose. And if you share it with somebody for another purpose, there's a risk that the third party might repurpose it, right? This happened with Cambridge Analytica, if y'all been following the news. Professor Kogan, right, collected the data for one purpose, shared the data was used for political marketing or whatnot. So actually, if we convinced Facebook to talk to us, which we did try back in 2014, who knows, maybe it would be a different world. But in any event, it's not. And so what you do once you do these annotations is you try and create statements in our language, right? It's a simple SQL-like syntax. It has a formal semantics and description logic. And so the reason we chose that logic is it allows us to compare concepts. Remember from the earlier work with the laws, we have these vague comparisons between concepts. So description logic allows us to make statements about vague boundaries like this. So once you create a statement like transfer information to third-party companies for performing services, you can then do different kinds of analysis. You can check whether or not the policy and a collection of policies that are linked together enforce that collection use limitation principle. You can look for conflicts within the policy. So do they say that they collect something for one purpose and later they say they won't collect it for that purpose, right? You could also do what we call data flow tracing in a policy. So you can do data flow tracing in code using static and dynamic analysis of the source code, but we can actually do it in a policy where if you talk about collecting certain types of information and using it and then sharing it, we can actually, using the DL, try and trace that transfer of that specific data item through the collection, use, and transfer, even into a third party. So this is the result of a case study with Waze and Flurry, where we did exactly that. And I'll just highlight one of the traces. So here we talk about, in Waze, they talked about collecting personal information from the Waze user for this very broad category, enhancing personal experience. Well, it turns out in the policy they also define as part of personal information a unique device ID, right? So there are statements where they say, for example, we collect personal information, for example, unique device ID or mobile device ID. Then what we could do with our strictly with our formalism, we could then analyze the Flurry policy on the right-hand side of that dotted line to look for collection statements where the concepts would include unique device ID, right? Based on the definition of the Flurry policy. And what we were able to find is that essentially there are statements that provide cover for sharing unique device ID with advertisers, right? And the reason that's important is because device ID is pretty identifying, and it's also used across different websites and across different applications. And so if advertisers can get that data, they can then track you across apps. So it's really a fundamental identifier. Also something you might want to protect. And in fact, in the authority policy, they describe what an add request is. They're very explicit about the structure of an add request, which we found surprising. The general takeaway is that small companies are very detailed about their data practices. As they get bigger, they lawyer up and vagueness starts to increase, right? And specificity decreases. So that gray line, though, created a new problem for us, right? The dotted line. We essentially had to align the terminology from one policy to another policy. And so what that looked like in this case study looks like this. So you have things like ads clicked, right? That's in the Ways policy. And in the authority policy, you have a concept called aggregated data. Now we know, based on our knowledge of advertising, that aggregate data includes statistical information, and it often includes statistical information for advertising. So based on our understanding of these concept boundaries, we can make relationships like this is a concept that's included in that more broad concept. We can say ads clicked is equivalent to clicks, or we could have said it's actually a subtype of clicks if there were other types of clicks, and so on. And if we can make these statements, then we can do the tracing that I just showed you. So this raised an issue for us. What we wanted to do is be able to build these ontologies and reuse them across policies. Well, the news got worse, right? It turned out we had a hypothesis. We said, well, what happens if we analyze one policy and then analyze another policy? Through the subsequent analysis, will we eventually saturate? I mean, is there a limited number of terms that people use to describe just information? The answer is no, right? Which is crazy. I never thought this would be. So what this chart shows you is that if you're analyzing the 31st policy in a set of policies, what proportion of the words in that 31st policy have you seen before? And now you can think about changing the order of the policies you're analyzing, right? And that means you have a range. So in the best case, the 31st policy might be close to 85% of the words in your new policy you've seen before. And the worst case, you're down here near 20%, okay? And so this is kind of shocking. I'll show you some examples of the kind of terms that we see in policies or information types, and you'll start to go, oh. So here's an example of contact information, financial information. So you can immediately start to see that some companies are very specific about what they include, like email header information is collected. That's actually through telecommunication providers. So when you're connecting to your email, they're collecting the email header information, right? The routing information for your email. Instant messaging address, a lot of addresses. In financial information, you'll see like debit card pins. So these would be used to complete payment transactions, right? The policy could just say financial information, but actually they do get specific. And so it's that specificity that creates all that variation in information types. And then I show you location information, surprisingly diverse ways to collect location. You could do real-time geographic location. You could do foot traffic data. It really depends on the policy author and how they want to describe the terminology, right? In health information, saliva sample. So there aren't devices that I know of that plug into your computer or mobile phone that collect your saliva. This was 23andMe, right? So the other thing to keep in mind is that companies in their privacy policies not only describe their apps, they also describe their brick and mortar or even mail-in interactions, right? So the policy actually covers a lot of different stuff. Yes.
So if I look back at your graph, it looks a lot like Heaps' law. I mean, if we just plot this in natural language,
okay.
As we add documents, the New York Times stories, right? New people keep showing up in the New York Times. People keep doing new things, but after the millionth New York Times story, fewer than after the first, right? So Heaps' law has been used to describe this in natural language before. Do you have a fit to Heaps' law on this data to see if you're diverging from it?
I don't, but I would love to talk to you more about that, because that slide depresses me. And this sounds like hope.
Well, no, it sounds like nature, right?
Okay.
We keep inventing new words, right? We're human.
And that's true. So with respect to that comment, there's a long tail, right, in these information types. And I had a slide where I would show you both the most frequent and the least frequent. And you start to see in that long tail that there's a lot of variation that's brand related. So Marriott has a rewards number, and so does Hilton. And they'll actually talk about their rewards numbers differently. So there's a very good chance that ontologically, if you're just interested in rewards numbers, the branding portion of the label, right, in that phrase doesn't matter, right? The challenge with ontology is that now you have to find some way to do those inferences about the comparisons. So that's kind of where we're going. But I still want to know about that law. So, yes.
One quick question
Yeah.
also, now that we are talking about lots of policies, so we're looking at all sorts of company policies, not just mobile apps for this portion?
Yeah, so
Okay.
what we did was we did stratified sampling. So a lot of people will do like the most popular apps,
Mhm.
but we wanted to see variation in business model and
Mhm.
business practice. So we looked at things like finance, health, we looked at shopping, hotels, restaurants, online dating. So quite a variation, and the intent was to really see a difference in business practices and information types.
Okay, but is it still like the mobile apps, but then obviously the policies for those, I'm sure Marriott probably has an app, but then that
Yeah.
policy is covered.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so Barnes & Noble's app is a good example.
Yeah,
The app's gone now, but before, it actually covered not only the mobile situation, but what happened in the store.
yeah, okay.
Yep. Okay, so the departure that we're taking has to do with semantics, right? So I was trained as a computer scientist, right? But my background is actually in anthropology and linguistic anthropology. So this is kind of an opportunity to go back and dig up the old roots and figure out where we got off track. So the basic idea is that when you're looking at these key phrases, right, like these information types, there's the notion of the symbol, the text, and then there's the meaning of the text. And what we really want to do is be able to translate, in some sense, a way to understand that relationship between the meaning and the actual symbol itself. And so there's work in ontology, but we were actually inspired by category theory in psychology. That's not like the mathematical version of category theory. And so there was early work in the 70s and 80s, but it kind of drops off. And so we're trying to revive this with the techniques that we have available to us today, partly building these large corpora, and then also going back to people and asking them what they think and comparing that to how these terms are written about in the text. So I'll show you really quickly how we do this. So in the 90s, there's a researcher out of Stanford that came up with this notion of patterns for understanding relationships between a hypernym, which is a superordinate category, more general category, and a hyponym, which is a subordinate category. Like, for example, personal information, right? Using this keyword, for example, can be a hypernym that contains name, address, and phone number. And so what we were interested in is finding patterns in the text that would allow us to extract these relationships. And Marty Hurst first talked about this in the 90s with respect to part-of-speech tagging. And since then, there have been some new techniques that we applied. So the technique that we applied, which is actually pretty stale by now, has to do with constituency parsers. So if you have part-of-speech tags, like something is a noun or a verb or an adjective, what you can do is build a hierarchy or tree based on phrase-level organizations of those words, right? So here you see NP, which means noun phrase, JJ stands for adjective, and then NN stands for noun. And what the constituency parse will do is translate your sentence into this tree. Then there's tools that we can use to actually match regular expressions against the tree, T-regex being one of them. And you can't see the pattern, it's kind of too low here, unfortunately. But the idea is that we can make a pattern that says, this is the hypernym, here's an important keyword, right, for example, and that would be hard-coded before in the example, and its relationship in the phrase. And then we would have a variable to say, and this is where we think the hyponym would be, right? And we would build these rules manually. So this is in contrast to something like machine learning, where you might be trying to annotate, your ground truth, and then use something like convolutional neural network. We haven't done anything like that. So the rule is to give you some understanding of the scope of the result. For about 30 policies, we had about 30 to 40 rules. For 60 policies, we're dealing with more than 70 rules. So the rules are very labor intensive to create. You have to have a lot of knowledge about how to do this, and then maintaining the rules as the data set grows also raises an issue. So, and then there are false positives you have to deal with, right? So the precision recall is kind of in the 70 to 80% range. So it's not the best solution, but it does allow us to collect what policies are saying about these relationships, and then we can compare to what people are thinking. So here's an example of just the category demographic information. We have 3 different kinds of websites here. So we have employment websites, Career Builder, and Simply Hire. We have health-related websites, MyFitnessPal and Mayo Clinic, and then we have telecommunications providers. So demographic information is often used to understand who your market is and to do advertising. And so notably, companies that are doing health or employment-related stuff, right, might be interested in occupation, your education and experience level. Companies that are doing health might be interested in your height and weight, your birthday to get your age, your exercise frequency. What was surprising to us is AT&T is interested in where you live and work, right, because they have access to that data. So the notion of demographic information, what the concept means, can change based on the business model of the company and the services they provide, right? So we actually recently did a study on demographic information in these different contexts, asking people what they thought the concept means, and that work is in submission right now. But essentially what we found is that people do have these ways to differentiate context. So for example, with contact information, we found that people most frequently, like the most salient words, were things like a phone number, right, an email address, whereas with another context like shopping, I think email address was there, but phone number wasn't there, right? So the idea being that with your bank, you might more frequently call, right? Meant that contact information was predominant with phone number, whereas if you're doing things like corresponding over email, then that would be more predominant. So the idea being that when you read this policy and someone refers to contact information, what is the predominant meaning that you should assume that your readers are going to be thinking about?
A couple of questions. I've been grappling with this precision and recall that you threw out as if, you know, they're in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
Would I maybe want one of them to be higher? So I might want a high recall and a low precision if I wanted to do this kind of analysis, where I wanted to know what Verizon was doing, because then I could go remove the incorrect ones by hand. On the other hand, if I had 100,000 of these, I might want high precision and low recall, because I wasn't going to do anything by hand at that scale. Are you actually tuning for equal precision and recall, sort of optimizing F1, or are you doing one or the other? Okay.
Yeah, no, this is a good point. So because we have this large and growing data set, we don't assume that we need to kind of keep these two things equal, right? So really high precision, what that gives us is a tool that we can run and have some confidence that we can trust the results, because there's not going to be a lot of false positives. The problem is it'll miss things, right? But if you have variation...
But presumably Comcast does the same thing Verizon does.
Yeah.
And so you could aggregate.
And that's what we believe, is that over time, if your tool is sufficiently sensitive to pick up variation in the domain, then you would be able to, if you don't catch it in Verizon's policy because of the way they write their sentences, you might catch it in AT&T's policy, because the way they write their sentences is the way you expect it to be written. Does that make sense? And so we do make that distinction. We haven't yet tried to raise recall, which would be interesting. Right now we're thinking, well, this is at scale, we want to have a tool that we can trust, and then just hope that there's enough variation in the domain we would eventually pick up things like that. Yeah, that's a good question. So we took these, so for our next evaluation, we took these phrase pairs and we went to people and we asked them, tell us what the ontological relationship is between these words. This was an interesting study for us. So we gave a brief tutorial on what it means to be a part of something. And then we have this button where they can kind of switch the order, and we told them to read, once they choose, they have to read back to themselves. That something like contact information is a part of the contact list, right, before making the selection. Now, of course, we ran this on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and if you really want to know some interesting stories about our experience with that platform, we should talk offline. That's a separate 1 hour talk. But what we did find was that using that platform, we could still collect what we think is useful data. So let me show you a result. What we were able to pick up on is different viewpoints on what an ontological relationship should look like, right? So here you have web browser, or web browser type and browser. And so out of, I think we had 25, 30 people we were trying to poll for this survey. 11 out of 30 said that browser is a whole that contains web browser type. So if you think structurally, you might think that browser type is a property of this concept of browser, right? But you can see that 9 people thought it was equivalent. So if I were to ask you what your web browser type is, you might say Safari or Firefox or Chrome. If I asked you what browser you're using, you would probably give me the same answer, right? And so, so we were able to pick up on that similarity in the data. Contact and contact list had a much crisper ontological distinction compared to the others. 24 out of 30 believe contacts are contact lists. But here you see something interesting, which is vague boundaries and terms, right? So screen content and user content. So screen content may exclude user content. It just depends on what's on the screen, right? But in some cases it could include. And so what happened is people struggled, right, across the entire population we surveyed. They really struggled to come up with the right categorization. And so you see this spread in the data when a term has a vague boundary compared to another term. Because they can also say there's no relationship. And we actually have phrase pairs where they do identify no relationship. So that allowed us to evaluate one of our techniques where we were prioritizing precision. So we had really high precision in that technique. And so to kind of close, essentially there's three big problems we're working on right now, right? The first problem is we've mostly done our analysis manually, and we want to move more into natural language processing. So we're very interested in taking tools that exist today and trying to understand how we can apply them to our policy and law problems. You know, if you're interested in machine learning or deep learning in particular, one thing you could think about is, are there any vector space models for legal text, right? I'm not aware of any, but that might help you if you want to use those techniques, for example. There's also challenges in labeling data at scale. So we've done a lot of work with crowdsourcing. We've built a lot of infrastructure around this, both studying how people perceive the instructions we give them, as well as trying to evaluate the quality of the data we get back, and also how to duplicate effort in order to reduce just weirdness in the data where people misunderstand or they game the system. There's a lot of gaming of the system. We've learned quite a bit about how to game the system and then how to detect gaming. So it's a complicated arrangement to use crowd workers in this way. That's not the only crowdsourcing platform out there, so we could look at others. But what we're really interested in is trying to take the task, focus the task so it's a simple task, it's not too boring, and then be able to collect essentially interpretations from people, what we call like micro-interpretations. And then we're interested in how we can compose those interpretations for more complex sentences. And then lastly, this has sort of drawn us into the space of how do people reason, right? And so now we're trying to dig back into those earlier papers from the 70s and 80s to understand some of the early research that was done on measuring categories and how people categorize things, and how we can actually bring that to bear on the problem we're looking at now. So that is the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
We have about 20 minutes.
So the quick summary of your crowdsourcing experience, is it something that you expect to go back to mechanical turk in the future, or you just want to avoid it at all costs now?
No. We still run tasks. So we've run over 40,000 hits to date. We have a lot of infrastructure in place. We do things like we try to control for the population that we're sampling from. We look at, to give you an example of some of the variations that we've had, right? So some of our instructions are things like identify any of the actions in this paragraph that are collection actions, usage actions, transfer actions, and they get to use different colors to code them. So they can select the word, press a key, and it colors it, right? And what we found is that there are some people who have very literal interpretations of those instructions. So say they see the word collect, they always highlight it very reliably, right? But if they see another word, like for example, the policy might say, you can invite your friends to participate, right? And so ontologically, you can ask yourself, is the invitation a form of collection, right? Or transfer of personal information? There's some engagement that's happening there where the friend gets a chance to link to you in the app, right? And so there's some workers who actually have richer spaces of interpretation that will allow them to make that selection. And so from a profiling standpoint, you could actually look for a mix of these kinds of people, right? And you can treat the results differently. And so we've gotten into that space of thinking more about the task and in the annotator's behavior with respect to what they're interpreting. There are some people who clearly just kind of highlight anything and it's inconsistent, so we've been improving our instructions over time. That's one thing crowd workers asked for. So we have like good and bad examples, and so when we give feedback, we always kind of reference those examples. In terms of the tooling, the part that scares us is that there's actually efforts to script against the survey. So you can do some JavaScript in different tools like Grease Monkey and Tamper Monkey that can allow you to understand the structure of the survey and to pre-populate responses. And you can actually do this with very complex data sets, right? So that it would be harder to determine if somebody is giving you a result based on a scripted response versus an actual human interpretation of the data. And so we've been developing tools to actually detect that and then try to raise flags so that we can stop that activity from happening.
Just a quick follow-on to that, is that why you ask people to read back, or it's not like...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, I was curious about that, like why do they read back the answer?
So the reading back is it's the only kind of verification that we can ask people to do so that they can be clear about the direction of the relationship. So there's a swap option where you can swap the order. So someone might read the phrase pair and think the second word is a part of the first, but they did click the swap.
Oh, I see.
And so the read back would then cause them to say, oh, maybe I need to click the
So
swap.
it'd be harder, I mean, do you actually listen to audio of like people reading stuff back, or no? You can read back in a different way?
Yeah, that would take a different IRB protocol.
Well, because it would also get around the automation thing too, right?
Right.
I mean, I guess maybe they could automate the voice too.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, is having some way for them to hear it. So I think the next step for that work, that survey, is probably to run it in person and have people walk through this and collect a more reliable data set than compare it to the crowd workers.
Right.
There's another issue with crowd workers is that it's a professionalized experience for many of them. What that means is there are tools to help them optimize their hourly rate, right? So as you complete these tasks, you have a scoreboard, like a leaderboard, but it's not other people, it's yourself. And it shows you your hourly rate based on the performance of your task. What that means is if you're trying to increase your hourly rate, which makes a lot of sense to do, right? Most people would think to do that. You'll try and find tasks that are very easy to complete in short time that pay well. And so there's this performance range that they're looking for and a payment range that they're trying to co-optimize. And so what we do get are people who try to do the bare minimum because of that range that they're optimizing for. And so that's a hard boundary to be within. We do reject people if they just do the bare minimum and there's clearly things that they missed. And so we try and give that feedback to them. That's part of the good and bad examples. But I think because of that optimization, there's a risk that in the general population, some proportion of the people responding won't even take the time to listen to that audio, right? So that's a risk. So I think to use this as a realistic and generalizable data set, some of this cross-validation where you do this in person would help.
Right.
It's not to say that by reducing your working memory, as somebody who's working on this task, reducing your working memory and response time in order to optimize your performance wouldn't still give you useful data, but I think it raises questions about whether or not that data is valid data. So, more work to be done.
This just strike me that the data collection protocol strikes me as a really difficult task. I'm thinking, if I had my undergraduates do that, and part of this is my long experience in teaching mostly undergraduate business students with the occasional computer science student in there. And they interpret questions so differently because they have a different mental model of how computers work.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody has the idea that the internet is a series of tubes, then they're going to come up with a very different answer to the kinds of what you're actually asking is sort of analogical reasoning. And I'm remembering, at least from decades ago, the best predictor of success in psychology graduate school was something called the Miller Analogies test.
Okay.
Which is much better than the GRE in anything. And the Miller Analogies test is, this is to this as, and you get 4 options, this is to this, that, so page is to book as scene is to movie, as opposed to dialogue is to soundtrack, right? And so you can see one of them is included in the other, in both of them, the other ones are sort of running in parallel. And so the ability to figure out the analog, how is this related to this, is actually, I'm thinking if I gave my students many of those questions, they would be in my office trying to figure out what I'm trying to do. The computer science students would probably interpret it entirely differently from business school students, who would probably interpret it very differently from the 8th graders. And so I think there's a whole lot of really complex stuff in there. So I'm kind of amazed you got anything useful at all.
Yeah.
When I was looking at was a mobile device as to device unique identifier, and that came up with a W.
Right.
Like, so does that? Am I understanding this correctly? That
Well, one is a whole of the other.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's
Okay. I'm fascinated. What are they thinking? This actually sounds really interesting. Like maybe some read aloud protocols would help in sort of understanding how people are reasoning about this, and what the role of sort of underlying base knowledge is in trying to figure this out.
No, I think it's fascinating. I think we're really, as computer scientists, we're really undertrained for what we're doing, right? In the sense that there's this larger body of literature, which we could tap into. In terms of what are people thinking, I think what's interesting about our results is it pushes up a little bit against the, the Kahneman-Tversky question about system 1 versus system 2. So the idea being, do you sit down and reason systematically and say, a device ID is a string that's encoded in a computer program, and the program is a resident on the mobile device, and so this is a partial relation. So only people who can do that have technical background experience, right? Domain knowledge.
Yes.
Many other people who don't know that, they would be operating on some kind of hunch, right? Or they might call it a guess, but it may still be informed by some resident tacit experience that they haven't made explicit in their mental model of the world, right? Which to me is really interesting. But are we measuring that? I don't know. And so that's why it would be interesting to sit people down and sort of have them walk through this. I do know that crowd workers have some degree of technical competence. There is also an emerging belief that they are essentially training to the task of surveys. And so they're becoming really good and informed about the topics that surveys tend to measure. And there are a lot of studies actually on things like mobile devices and mobile apps. So they could be learning quite a bit actually, even though they never program any of these devices. But yeah, I'm interested in all these questions. And I think the background experience, I mean, I mentioned that in one of my, my third slide is really understanding the relationship between context effects. So when we show the question and we add things like on a shopping website versus at a banking website, that affects how they interpret those concepts. If they have an experience or don't have an experience, that affects how they respond. And so we are interested in these details. The challenge we're facing is that our colleagues are generally not so interested. They kind of see this as, why are you even asking these people? It's so subjective. Why can't you just create the answer, right? Don't you know? And so we're trying to push away from that. So our notion of ontology is no longer just somebody sits down and builds the ontology. It's more about how do you accommodate multiple viewpoints where they might be conflicting. And so the ontology is not only probabilistic, but it's depending on the viewpoint, it would give a different answer. And so we're interested in that space, but formally. That's a great point.
Is it Alessandro Acquisti at CMU who does work on trying to quantify or assign costs to privacy? Does your work overlap with any of that in terms of like maybe certain phrases will affect bounded rationality in different ways, like being more specific, like sound stereo?
Yeah, so Alessandro is a behavioral economist, and so he tends not to follow the rational model of decision making. Him and I had a conversation about that. But we do have another line of research that does focus on risk estimation. So one thing we are interested in is how people make decisions with respect to these scenarios. So if somebody's collecting your device ID, for example, do you perceive that, and they're using it for advertising, or it could be your health status, and they're using that for purposes other than medical treatment, right? And so what we want to do is put people in different scenarios in that work, understand how they might make different decisions about their willingness to share information. So we have done that research, and we've got a Tokai paper that's in review right now, just accepted major revision, so we send them the revision back. So we're excited about it. Basically what we found is there are certain variables you can manipulate to affect people's perception of the risk, right? The work also pushes back against the notion that there is some ground truth about risk, right? So you can think of risk like in a motor vehicle, right? So we have some measurement of the number of accidents and things like this, but we actually don't know about all the accidents. And so the value we would use to predict the likelihood of an accident may underestimate, right? And insurance companies deal with this in order to create a large enough margin that they can still profit and that sort of stuff. But if you go back to the original risk literature, what often happens is people can't make these estimations without having complete design knowledge, right? Some of the earlier work was done by Breaux at CMU also, and he was looking at the risk of nuclear power, right? So average people don't understand the complexity or designs of nuclear power plants or the safety mechanisms in them or any of this stuff. But people wanted to know whether or not they felt there was a risk based on living close or near a farm. And so his work actually illuminated this notion of perceived risk, and we kind of built on that. So we also believe that relates to this domain because people don't know the design space of mobile apps like I talked about before. But one interesting finding we had was that as societal benefit increased, people were more willing to share their information, right? Which could actually help public policymakers if they knew, for example, that they wanted, to collect information to afford people like better health recommendations across state lines, which is still kind of challenging, right? Because there's no notion of a health record that can go across state lines. The state laws are different. So then that could be sort of motivation for maybe investing in some program like this. But perceived risk is also about awareness. You have to communicate to the individual what's happening, and that can change their perception of the risk level. So, I mean, I could give another talk on that too, as you can probably imagine. But yeah, we are interested in that, especially as it relates to these policies and how developers would make choices. Would they protect one type of information more because the public feels that that's riskier in terms of the practice that's taking place? And trying to increase that communication, I think, helps. Could help.
I don't know that much about policy writings, but is there any differences in the writing style between websites and between, of course, legal statements might be similar from states, but in terms of policies, like, they might be using different languages in terms of describing the same thing.
Yeah, there's definitely that. So there are certain things that might be similar, like information related to account registration. You might see more commonalities. I think that would be determined because the account registration process is similar across applications, as opposed to the writing style being similar. There are certain sections of policies that are definitely similar, like anything to do with compliance with very narrow regulations. So California has a very specific law. COPPA is very specific about protecting children's information. And so companies don't want to mess around with getting their statements wrong on that, right? Where you see a lot of variation has to do with the different domains that they're in. And then some companies try to be a little clever. So if you have counsel, right, a lawyer, write your policy, it's going to be written for a court. If you have your user experience designer write your policy, it's going to be written for the person to make them kind of enjoy the experience of reading a policy, right? And in that case, they tend not to be like not boilerplate, but just long text documents. They tend to be layered, right? And so you might interact with the policy so that you can say, oh, I'm interested in this. Let me click through and learn more about that topic. And those policies are harder for us to analyze because we have to serialize them essentially. But there are differences. And then in terms of state laws, it really depends on Some states are leading. They write a regulation to cover a topic first, and then others will follow it. Some states are more liberal or conservative. And so if you're in a conservative state, you're not going to go borrow the regulation from a liberal state, right? Simply because the values and how you regulate will be different, right? So, so you do see some copying and variation like that. And then there's just weird, quirky stuff that gets in the news. So, like Massachusetts in their data breach law said that you have to have a very specific bit level in your encryption, right? Which was, I think, 128 at the time, AES 128, I don't know what it was. And, you know, that was great for that day and age, but computer security professionals were like, wait a minute, you know, if you force companies to not be able to raise their, you know, their encryption complexity over time, then you're creating this huge vulnerability, right? So, so, you know, attorney generals will react to things. It's kind of a complex ecosystem that affects what the law looks like and also affects what gets enforced and ultimately affects what software companies need to focus on.
So is that variation part of your strategies, future work, or you don't consider that kind of different writing styles?
Yeah, so let's see. So we're cognizant of it to be realistic. So we have to do that. We have to know what lawyers and regulators are doing just so that we know that we're working on a problem in a way that accounts for the idiosyncrasies of the world, right? We are actually interested now in looking at comparing text. So if you remember, I had these metrics where I was looking for differences between two regulatory statements. So now what we're hoping to do is explore techniques in NLP that would allow us to do some of that automatically, right? And so that is a topic we're looking at. Yeah. Oh, there's one more question?
Oh, sorry, okay.
That's all right. Coming from the policy side of things, I know you're saying that there's differences between states politically and how they're forming policies, but there's a vast amount of literature about how they decide to adopt and what they adopt from different states. So as you delve into the NLP side, could this become more of a predictive framework where once you get a large enough lexicon, you could be generating stock policies, stock regulatory statements that states could say, all right, we have variation from Massachusetts and Maine and Tennessee, and we want to talk about this statement. We have this library of policies that we could generate something that's a bit more apolitical, and then policymakers could then go ahead and tweak. And then on that same end, could it also be a self-updating guide? So as it goes out and searches and says, regulators are doing this, industry is doing this, and we're recommending cyber updates on this, or privacy updates on this. So policymakers could be getting cues of saying, you need to revisit some of your current policies because your neighboring states are changing, industry's changing. So it could form these base frames on which policymakers could then supplement and complement, or also a notification to update sort of regulation as well.
Yeah, so that fits into the big picture for us, which is we originally envisioned something like a regulatory weather map, right?
Yeah.
Where you could make forecasts. And I think, you know, just maybe as an example, the work that we had right here, where we started to see different patterns of how states were regulating a specific issue. These patterns could be the kind of thing that we could imagine reusing. One source of data that we haven't looked at yet, which I think fits into your comment as well, has to do with proposed regulation. So much of what we're seeing is actually regulation that passed, but in the process of making that law, right, there were trials in different states, and sometimes those trials sit for years before something actually passes. So pulling in that additional text could give us more to work with in terms of legal language. It might also give us a sense of being able to predict maybe why a regulation ends up passing and which ones didn't pass, and maybe look at comparisons that way. So I think that's a really good idea, and actually that would help companies and regulators perhaps coordinate better, right, to have conversations about like what is the appropriate way to regulate. So yeah, definitely, it's some of the fundamentals that we have to work on to get to that point have eluded us because we've been so bogged down with the manual analysis. And so now our hope is to automate different portions of this that will allow us to look at the scale of regulation as it changes. So.
Well, thank you very much, Travis, for that delightful presentation. And we also still have some spots available We're going to lunch with Travis, so if anyone is free for an hour, and that's lunch on CASCI. Feel free to join.
All right, thank you.
Bring your whole class.
Oh, I'm sure they'd love it.
But now you have a multi-million-dollar business idea.
Yeah, totally. Gotta make it a reality.
Exactly.
We already got to marketing, it's great.
I can send you the slides.
It'd be great.
Okay. Can you send me an email? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks,
So I'm curious on the question of whether there's have you noticed differences in regulatory frameworks?
How was, and stuff. I felt so bad that I wasn't.
In the end, I think I was happier with the ILS paper than the budget paper.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, do you have lunch? I brought her lunch. Do you want? Okay.
I really was happy for long form,
And,
I think for
especially
policy
specifically
discussion, so.
And so that could be something that we could
We
expand
can,
into.
you know, we'll
We've
get to
largely
R&R, we
been
can,
focused on state.
yeah, and, yeah, I
Just
think we
because
should
state and federal,
start
so we did
talking
work
about
with
that
people.
before. Worst comes to worst,
We've done work
I
with
think it lends
Computational,
itself
we started to work
to,
with Computational.
just in the format,
But
it's
it's,
a
there's so
very
much
easy
like,
conversion to a journal article.
Like the user
Yeah,
section,
yeah, and there's also, when I
Right.
was going back, like, back through
It's
my,
different.
they
the
come up
deep
with
dive
new
CI
ideas.
stuff, I was definitely like, I really hope
Yeah.
Coherence is right. So, even, yeah, I was hoping that during the R&R.
So I think
could sit
that's
down and
part of the
like,
reason why
and
maybe
you would,
GDPR
here's
is
what
complicated,
here's how I interpreted
because
these terms.
There's vague
I
language.
don't know if that
in
was
GDPR.
correct or not. Not
Yeah.
correct, but like,
And,
does it make
you know,
sense?
countries like
Spirited?
Germany
Yeah,
might get
I
out
mean,
ahead
so
of
I think it's
their
okay, I think we
regulation.
need a
Yeah.
little bit
And
of
other
luck
countries
with
have
the
this
reviewer,
mistake.
like
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
R&R, and if we
Wanna
can, if we
emulate
do, I
Germany
think,
because
even if
they're
we're
the,
borderline, we can
you know,
revise it
the
sufficiently
10,000
and push it
pound
over.
gorilla in terms of
Yeah,
economic
yeah,
power.
but I had a similar thought too,
So,
I was like, even if
yeah,
it
it's a
doesn't
different
get
set
in
of
here,
politics.
I
It's
feel
not
like
something I
there's a
feel
lot
like
we
we could just
No, I
move
think there's a
into.
lot of
We
like
have to have somebody
information
who pays
policy,
attention.
like,
Yeah.
who understands
that
that
we need
space.
to go to.
yeah.
Fantastic topic.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming.
Alright, I actually have to run upstairs and get a form, so I will be right back.
I wanted to introduce myself since
Hey.
I knew you, Jessica.
Hey, Jessica.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't make the talk.
No, that's okay. I did get your email, and I couldn't probably stick around. The problem I have a meeting, I have my student meetings at 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm gonna try and catch those. But I can check for 30 minutes if you're free to.
Yeah, yeah, so my class ends right around 1:45, but it's right across the street, so I just, I'm usually back here by 1:45 or 1:50, so.
Okay. You wanna do that?
Yeah, that's fine,
Excellent. Yeah.
so, and my office is in this area, so,
And Priya can show me.
yeah.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
Call them all.
Yeah, actually, you know, normally when there's like 10 people, you're like, okay, and people are just gonna like, oh, thanks, and walk out of the room,
Yeah.
take an orange. But actually, everybody was really engaged. So
Yes,
I enjoyed that.
CASCI's a smaller but more engaged group than some of the like bigger
Bigger
groups,
departments.
yeah, so,
Yeah, and then the diversity of questions was also interesting.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
natural language and policy.
yeah,
Yeah.
which is pretty standard for an high school.
Yeah.
Everybody's coming from, you know, different methodological and theoretical backgrounds, so.
Yeah, high schools are a different thing for me. I mean, I know computer science departments.
Yeah, you're in CS at CMU?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm actually in what would be called the software engineering department.
Okay.
So we have a school of computing, and then we have these renegade breakouts like LTI, which is language technologies. They have their department.
Yeah.
Robotics has a department. So, yeah, so I'm in the software engineering department.
Yeah.
But it's still computer science.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously the main people I know there are the Scilab folks.
Okay.
So with Cups and
Yep, yep.
like Lori
Lori
and
Kramer and
Alessandro.
Yeah. So I collaborate. We're on a frontier project of privacy
Okay.
policy.
Yeah. Great.
Cool. Well, at 2 o'clock, I'll come and find you.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then we can chat
I'll be in
a
my
little more.
office. Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah.
See you later.
Yeah, enjoy your lunch.
Thanks.
You done?
Good?
Good.
Yeah.
It's listed talk
Where's he at?
CASCI
He's
today.
Okay.
According to a
He's teaching at.
listening thing.
To last minute
Oh, that's interesting.
She did.
Priya would know better
Okay.
why she.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to like,
figure out which was gonna come.
you know, make any sort